This episode was inspired by Bülent Altinsoy, a Microsoft MVP, who ran a 4-hour technical Dataverse deep dive workshop at M365Con. He stayed in the mechanics, tables, relationships, security solutions. The parts teams rush through because they want the app on the screen. This episode sits above that. Most teams don't fail because Power Apps is low code. They fail because they treat data like a temporary inconvenience, something to clean up after the demo. Dataverse isn't a magic database. It's Microsoft quietly offering you a way to model reality with enough discipline that automation and AI can survive contact with production. This isn't about features. It's about why the model underneath becomes strategy, whether you intended it or not. Why low-code data keeps failing in production. The comfortable story is that low-code fails because makers don't know governance. That's not the failure mode. Low-code data fails in production because the first version of the model is usually a lie that everyone agrees to, temporarily, so they can ship something. Speed-first delivery patterns create a very specific kind of debt, meaning debt. You get columns like status, owner, notes, type, and other. You get a single table that quietly becomes the dumping ground for 3 different business concepts. You get lookups that exist because the UI needed a dropdown, not because the organization agreed on what the relationship actually means. And in week 1, it works. The form loads, the flow triggers, the Canvas app feels like progress. The leadership slide deck has a screenshot. Everyone relaxes. Then production happens. Not the go-live date. Real production, time, volume, edge cases, mergers, audits, new teams, new apps, new integrations. That's when the model stops being a convenient container and becomes an argument the system has to resolve thousands of times a day. Here's what most people miss. Scaling doesn't just multiply transactions. It multiplies contradictions. If your model doesn't encode meaning, every downstream consumer invents meaning. Your Power Automate flow invents one interpretation. Your reporting model invents another. The model-driven app form invents a third. And now your organization isn't automating. It's negotiating with itself through software. This is why the "it works" phase is dangerous. Early success isn't proof you modeled well. It's proof you haven't hit the hard questions yet. Bülent Altinsoy, a Microsoft MVP, puts it cleanly in his Dataverse workshop at M365Con. Architecture is a story, not a snapshot. That line matters because most teams treat the model like a snapshot, whatever shape the data needed to be in for today's screen. But architecture behaves like a story. The plot keeps moving, new characters appear, and the decisions you locked in during the pilot become the rules the system enforces in year 2. And when you try to retrofit structure later, you don't pay in one place. You pay everywhere. Schema churn becomes your tax. You rename a column. Now you break a flow. You update the flow. Now you break a report. You update the report. Now you break the integration. You patch the integration. Now your environment layering and solutions are messy, so deployments get risky. So teams start just making the fix directly in production, which means now you're not doing ALM, you're doing archaeology. This is how low code turns into high maintenance. And the core reason is almost always the same. The model never stabilized around business concepts. It stabilized around delivery pressure. The foundational misunderstanding is that data modeling is optional until later. It isn't. In Dataverse, and really in any platform that wants to be enterprise-grade, the model is the control plane for everything downstream. Security, behavior, integration, reporting, and now AI grounding. Weak models don't just create bad data, they create conditional chaos, because every exception becomes an entropy generator. You add just one extra status value because a stakeholder needed it. You add just one extra column because a workflow didn't fit the existing structure. You add just one environment because dev, test, prod is too much ceremony. Each one feels small. Over time, policies drift away. Naming drifts, relationship behavior drifts, and then the system still runs, but you are no longer operating a deterministic security and data model. You're operating a probabilistic one. That's what production feels like. Not broken, just unpredictable. And this is why SharePoint lists keep showing up as the early substrate. They're fast, familiar, and cheap. They also train teams into flat thinking. You can get surprisingly far with flat thinking, right up until the organization tries to ask cross-cutting questions, enforce ownership, or introduce AI that needs context. At that point, your list-based database collapses into duct tape and thresholds. And then the migration happens under stress during audit findings or when the next strategic initiative needs a real system of truth. So the real problem isn't that low-code teams move too fast. It's that they move fast without deciding what's true. And Dataverse, when used properly, is Microsoft trying to force that decision earlier while it's still cheap. Because once you have 3 apps, 10 flows, 5 reports, and 1 Copilot agent depending on your model, changing meaning is no longer refactoring. It's rewriting history. That distinction matters. And it leads directly to the next point. Dataverse is not a database in the way most people mean it. It's a semantics engine. Dataverse is not a database, it's a business semantics engine. Most organizations approach Dataverse like it's just a nicer place to store rows. That mental model is convenient, it is also wrong. A database stores facts. Dataverse stores facts plus meaning, relationships, ownership, security boundaries, metadata, and lifecycle behavior that travel with the data across apps, automation, and increasingly AI. That distinction matters because once you treat Dataverse like just storage, you start stripping out the exact parts that make it valuable. You push logic into Power Automate because it feels easier. You treat relationships like optional because the form still loads without them. You ignore security design because we'll add roles later. And then you end up with the same chaos you had before, just with a different price tag. In architectural terms, Dataverse is a business semantics engine. It takes the messy human version of your business, things like customer, case, approval, asset, contract, exception, and forces you to encode those as durable primitives. Tables aren't UI scaffolding, columns aren't random fields, relationships aren't navigation links. They're commitments about what your organization believes is true. Think of Dataverse like a compiler. You write intent in structure, nouns, attributes, constraints, and relationships. Dataverse compiles that into consistent behavior across the platform. Model-driven apps, Canvas apps, Power Automate, Power Pages, reporting, and now agents that need grounded context. If you don't compile intent, every consumer interprets it. That's the difference between a model that scales and a model that drifts. This is why Bülent keeps repeating that it's not about the license, it's the language underneath. The license conversation is always louder because it's easy. Meaning is quieter because it's work, but meaning is what you're actually buying when you adopt Dataverse. Dataverse has built-in gravity. It nudges teams toward consistent definitions because the platform rewards it. If you define an ownership model, security can be expressed in roles rather than in tribal rules. If you define relationships properly, model-driven apps stop being fragile screen flows and become different views over the same truth. If you name things consistently and add descriptions, you don't just help humans, you reduce ambiguity for every system that depends on metadata, including Copilot and agentic tooling. And if you don't do those things, Dataverse doesn't break immediately. It does something worse. It lets you succeed just enough to scale the mistake, because the platform is strong enough to carry a weak model for a while. And then when you reach the point where multiple apps converge on the same schema, the lack of semantics turns into friction. Inconsistent reporting, unpredictable security, integration confusion, and AI that can't retrieve meaning because you never made it explicit. Here's the weird part. Dataverse isn't trying to make building apps harder. It's trying to make building reality unavoidable. That's why the feature set feels opinionated compared to a simple list or a generic SQL table. You get solutions and environments because deployment is part of meaning. You get role-based security and ownership because access is part of meaning. You get relationship behavior, parental, referential, restricted, because data integrity is part of meaning. Those relationship behaviors sound like implementation detail until you're in production and someone asks, if we delete the parent, what happens to the child records? If your answer is, it depends, that's not flexibility, that's unbounded risk. And Dataverse is built to make those risks explicit early when you can still decide intentionally. For leaders, this is the strategic shift. Clarity becomes a platform capability, not a heroic effort. A good Dataverse model is how an organization scales shared language. It's how a new app can be built without renegotiating what customer means. It's how a new integration can map to stable identifiers instead of fragile strings. It's how an audit question can be answered by structure, not by a meeting. So when people say Dataverse is a database, what they're really saying is, we plan to use it like storage, and storage is never the hard part, meaning is. Once you accept that Dataverse is a semantics engine, you also accept the consequence. Modeling isn't busy work. It's how you encode intent so the platform can enforce it at scale. And that leads to the next uncomfortable truth. If modeling encodes intent, then modeling is leadership work, whether you admit it or not. Why data modeling is a leadership topic. Most organizations pretend data modeling is a technical detail. That's convenient because it means leadership can focus on delivery dates, adoption numbers, and licensing spreadsheets, while someone else handles the data. That delegation is the original sin, because the model isn't an implementation detail. It's a set of decisions about what the business is, what it cares about, and what it's willing to enforce. Those are leadership decisions, even when they're made silently by whoever built the first table on a Friday afternoon. And here's the part people hate. The model will outlive the app. Apps get rewritten, screens get redesigned, Power Automate flows get replaced. But the data model becomes sediment. It accumulates assumptions. It becomes the shared substrate everyone builds on, even when nobody admits they're building on it. So when leaders treat modeling as something the makers do, what they're really doing is outsourcing the definition of reality, and then they act surprised when reality becomes ungovernable. This is the uncomfortable truth. Governance, compliance, and auditability aren't layers you bolt on later. They emerge from structure, or they don't exist. If you want predictable behavior under stress, an audit, a breach, a regulatory request, a merger, then you need the system to answer questions deterministically. Who owns this record? Who can see it? Who changed it? What does approved mean? What does closed mean? What happens when the parent is removed? Those questions don't get answered by policy memos. They get answered by the authorization graph, the relationship behavior, the constraints, and the metadata you encoded or failed to encode. That distinction matters because it explains why so many governance initiatives feel like theater. They write documents, they build slide decks, they create committees, but the platform keeps operating according to the model, not the memo. Entropy always wins when intent is not enforced by design. So if leaders want fewer incidents and fewer 2 a.m. war rooms, they don't need more governance documents. They need fewer ambiguous models. And that means leadership has to take ownership of a simple but brutal responsibility, naming and defining the core concepts of the business, not the app features, the nouns: customer, vendor, request, case, asset, policy, exception, approval, department, project. If those words mean different things to different teams, Dataverse will faithfully scale that confusion across every app you build. It doesn't fix organizational ambiguity, it amplifies it. That's why good models scale clarity, bad models scale meetings. Because when the model is clear, teams stop arguing about what a thing is. They can argue about what to do with it, which is at least productive. When the model is vague, every meeting turns into a translation exercise. People spend time negotiating semantics instead of executing. And once AI enters the picture, the cost of semantic drift becomes visible. Humans can compensate for ambiguity. They remember context. They know that status equals other really means waiting on procurement because they were in the meeting when it was decided. Agents don't have that meeting memory. They have whatever you made explicit in the model plus whatever your metadata implies. If you didn't define ownership, you can't reliably enforce access. If you didn't define relationships, you can't reliably retrieve context. If you didn't define stable identifiers, you can't reliably integrate without brittle string matching. So leadership's job becomes less about approving apps and more about enforcing assumptions at scale. And no, that does not mean leaders should micromanage table design. It means leaders should demand clarity and then fund the work to encode that clarity. This is where most organizations fall into the delegation trap. They ask a team to build an app, but they don't ask anyone to define the system of truth. They don't appoint an accountable owner for the data model. They don't decide what gets standardized and what stays local. They don't decide which concepts are global and which are contextual. So the team makes those decisions implicitly, under delivery pressure, and later the organization pays for them explicitly under operational pressure. If you want a simple leadership test for Dataverse, ask who owns the model, not who built the app. Who owns the model? If the answer is IT, that usually means nobody. If the answer is the makers, that means chaos with good intentions. If the answer is the business, but nobody can name a specific role with authority, that means meetings. A real owner makes the model a product. They defend it. They evolve it deliberately. They resist entropy generators. They align environments, solutions, and releases to protect stability. Because in Dataverse, the model is the strategy surface, and leadership either shapes it on purpose or inherits it by accident. From tables to business concepts, what a table really represents. Everything gets simpler when you stop treating a table like storage and start treating it like a statement. Every table is a business decision, not a technical one, a decision. When you create a table, you're declaring, this thing exists in our world. It has a life cycle, it has owners, it has rules, and we intend to ask questions about it later. And when you don't create a table, when you hide the concept inside a text field, a choice column, or worse, a spreadsheet, you're declaring the opposite. This concept is optional. We won't protect it, we won't govern it, we won't reason over it. That's why modeling isn't about being tidy. It's about choosing what reality your platform is allowed to remember. Most teams start from screens because screens are visible. You can point to a form and say, look, progress. You can demo a button and call it value. So the model becomes a reflection of UI needs. One table per screen, one column per input, one lookup because the dropdown needed it. That's screen-driven modeling, and it always collapses under time because the UI is the most volatile part of the system. People change forms constantly, new fields, new sections, new views, new just one more requirements. If your model mirrors screens, you guarantee schema churn. And schema churn is how you create operational debt in Dataverse because every downstream artifact attaches to schema, flows, reports, integrations, business rules, plugins, agents, and yes, security assumptions. Everything clicked for a lot of teams when they realized a simple distinction. Tables are nouns, processes are verbs. A table should represent a business noun that exists across time. Customer, case, contract, asset, policy, approval, exception, invoice, claim. Those are durable concepts. A process should be expressed as behavior around those nouns. Transitions, validations, routing, notifications, calculations, and state changes. The foundational mistake is when teams store verbs as columns. They create fields like step 1 completed, step 2 completed, approval number 3, current approver, previous approver, escalation reason 2. That's not modeling. That's an abandoned workflow engine trapped inside a table. It feels fast until you need to change the process, because now your schema is your workflow. Dataverse will let you do this. Dataverse will also make you regret it, because processes change more frequently than nouns. If you bake the process into the table schema, you force breaking changes every time the business learns something new. If you keep the noun clean and express the process through related entities, like approvals, assignments, decisions, exceptions, you get a model that can evolve without rewriting history. Columns are commitments. A column is not a place to put data. It's a promise. We will keep this true, we will validate it, we will secure it, and we will query it. That means every column should earn its existence. If you add a column because someone asked for it in a meeting but nobody can say what decision will be made from it, that column becomes future confusion. It becomes a place where people put different interpretations and then AI has to guess which interpretation is correct. And relationships are reality. Relationships are the part that most teams treat like plumbing because in the UI they look like navigation links. But a relationship is you writing the business story in cardinalities and behavior. One-to-many is structure. One customer has many cases, one contract has many amendments, one project has many tasks. Many-to-many is policy, when the association itself matters. People and skills, users and roles, products and categories. When you need to govern the relationship, not just reference it, the relationship becomes its own first-class concept. The weird part is that this is where low-code doesn't mean low thinking becomes brutally true. Because Dataverse will happily let you build apps with a weak model, it will also happily scale your weak model into 5 apps, 10 flows, and a copilot agent that answers with a shrug. So here's the mental move that changes everything. When you sketch a table, don't ask, what fields do we need on the form? Ask, what thing exists in our business even when no one is looking at the screen? If it exists, it deserves a noun. If it has a life cycle, it deserves a table. If it relates to other things, it deserves relationships that encode that truth. And once you model nouns instead of screens, you discover where the leverage actually is. Not in more columns, in relationships. Relationships, how the organization actually works, not how the UI looks. Relationships are where Dataverse stops being tables and fields and starts behaving like an organization. Most teams treat relationships as a UI convenience. I need a drop down here, so I'll add a lookup. That's not a relationship, that's a form control with a database behind it. A real relationship is an assertion about reality. What depends on what? What can exist alone? What gets deleted? What gets reassigned? What gets shared? And what gets inherited? In other words, how your organization actually works when nobody is looking at the screen. This is why relationships become the differentiator. They don't just connect data, they create context. Context is what makes reporting sane, integration stable, and AI answers coherent. Without relationships, every query is blind. With relationships, the platform can navigate meaning. One-to-many relationships are the backbone of structure. One customer, many cases. One project, many tasks. One continent, many countries. Bülent's simple workshop example. It sounds like Dataverse 101, but it's the same pattern that decides whether your system behaves deterministically or degenerates into interpretation. Because one-to-many isn't just about navigation, it's about integrity. If a country belongs to exactly one continent, you shouldn't represent that with a text field called continent name and hope everyone spells Europe the same way. You represent it with a relationship that makes the association explicit, enforceable, and queryable. Now, the platform can do what platforms do: prevent contradictions, support consistent filtering, and reuse the same structure across multiple apps. And then there's the part most teams skip: relationship behavior. Bülent calls this out directly. Relationships aren't just connections. Behavior matters. Dataverse forces you to decide what happens when the parent changes or disappears: referential, parental, restrict, custom. These aren't academic settings, they're operational consequences. If you delete a parent record, do child records get deleted too? That's parental behavior. In some domains, that's correct. If the parent never existed, the child shouldn't exist. In other domains, it's a disaster. We deleted the customer, therefore we deleted the cases. Great way to lose audit evidence. If you restrict deletes, you're saying the system will block you until you resolve the dependency. That feels annoying in a demo. In production, it's a safety rail. If you keep it referential, you're saying the link matters, but the child can survive if the parent is removed. That's often the right call when the child record is evidence, history, or legal artifact. This is why relationship design is not just data modeling. It's policy encoded as behavior. And many-to-many relationships are where teams either get serious or get sloppy. Many-to-many is what you use when the relationship itself matters. People and skills, contracts and clauses, products and categories, agents and the cases they touched. This is not a list of tags. This is a business fact that deserves its own life cycle when it carries meaning. A common mistake is trying to fake many-to-many with multiple lookup fields. Vehicle 1, Vehicle 2, Vehicle 3. Or Approver 1, Approver 2, Approver 3. It works until the fourth one exists, and the fourth one always exists. The better mental model is, if the association can have attributes, it's not a link, it's an entity. User assigned to case becomes assignment, with timestamps, reasons, escalation flags, and audit trail. Agent touched record becomes agent interaction, with state, outcome, and confidence. Now you can query it, secure it, report it, and give AI something grounded to retrieve. This is also where the SharePoint pattern collapses. SharePoint lookups are not relational integrity, they are references. And references without behavior create ambiguity at scale. Orphaned items, duplicated meanings, and brittle reporting logic that someone will eventually fix in Excel. So the practical rule is simple. Model the relationship the way the business would explain it out loud. If the explanation includes, and when that happens, then the relationship has behavior. And if you can't explain the relationship clearly, that's your signal. The organization doesn't agree on reality yet. Don't hide that disagreement inside a lookup. Resolve it. Because once AI shows up, it will not ask politely. It will traverse whatever graph you gave it and return whatever story your relationships imply. Accurate relationships don't just make apps nicer, they make the organization legible. Solutions and environments. Why delivery is an architecture decision. Once relationships are correct, most teams make the next predictable mistake. They treat delivery like an operational detail. They build in whatever environment is convenient. They ship by exporting whatever they remember to export. They fix issues by editing production directly because it's faster. And then they look confused when the platform becomes undeployable. Dataverse doesn't separate delivery from architecture. It makes delivery part of the model. Environments are not just places to click around. They are boundaries where different versions of reality exist at the same time. Development is where you experiment. Test is where you validate the behavior under stress. Production is where you stop experimenting because the business is paying for stability. If you blur those boundaries, you don't just risk bugs, you create meaning drift. Because the schema you're changing is not a neutral object, it is the definition every app, flow, report, and agent depends on. When you make changes in production, you're rewriting the rules while the game is in progress. Bülent's warning here is blunt. Live development in production never ends well. Never. Not because the platform is fragile, but because humans are. People forget what they changed. They forget why they changed it. They leave half-finished artifacts in the active layer, and then the next deployment fails because the environment is no longer what you think it is. This is where solutions matter. A solution is not a zip file. It is a transport mechanism for metadata. Tables, columns, relationships, forms, views, apps, flows, security roles, environment variables, and now increasingly copilot and agent components. And that metadata-only detail is the one that keeps hurting people, because teams assume a solution is how you move business data. It isn't. It's how you move the definition of the system. The schema, not the rows. The contract, not the content. So when someone asks, can we just export the solution and we'll have production data too? The answer is no, and the follow-up answer is the one nobody likes. If you built a deployment process, assuming that you didn't build deployment, you built copying. This distinction matters because ALM is not a DevOps hobby. It's how you prevent architectural erosion. If you can't deploy repeatably, you can't govern change. If you can't govern change, your model becomes a moving target. If your model becomes a moving target, every integration becomes brittle, every report becomes suspect, and every copilot prompt becomes a workaround for schema ambiguity. Now add the managed versus unmanaged tension. Unmanaged solutions are freedom now. Managed solutions are control later. And teams love freedom right up until they need rollback, auditability, and the ability to say this is what's deployed and this is why. The unmanaged approach leaves you with environment pollution. Changes stick around. Active layer overrides become permanent. You can't cleanly uninstall. You can't reason about dependencies. And when something goes wrong, troubleshooting turns into which version of reality is this environment actually running? Managed solutions, in contrast, give you a controlled deployment surface. You can version, you can patch, you can uninstall, you can reduce the number of hands modifying production. You trade convenience for determinism. Yes, dependency management can become a headache. Yes, layering can slow you down when you're debugging. But the alternative is not fast. The alternative is conditional chaos. And here's the leadership angle again. Environments and solutions are not engineering ceremony. They are how you defend meaning over time. Because every time you allow just this once, changes in production, you're teaching the organization that intent is optional. You're teaching them that the model is negotiable and negotiation always accumulates. So the minimum viable discipline in Dataverse is simple: a development environment, a test environment, and a production environment. A solution strategy that defines what moves and how, and a bias toward managed deployments once you leave experimentation. If you don't do this, the platform will still run. It will also quietly convert your system of truth into a system of exceptions. And the first real wake-up call is almost always the same. SharePoint. Scenario 1. SharePoint to Dataverse, convenience versus correctness. Most organizations don't choose SharePoint lists as a database. They drift into it. It's already there. Everyone has access. Someone can make a list in 10 minutes, add a couple columns, and suddenly the business feels like it got an app without asking IT for permission. That early momentum is real. It's also the start of a very specific failure pattern. Convenience becomes the data model, and then everyone builds policy on top of convenience. SharePoint lists feel good enough early because they're optimized for the first week. Flat data, simple forms, quick views, and a UI that trains people to think in columns, not concepts. And when the problem is truly a list, tasks, simple intake, lightweight tracking, SharePoint can be the right substrate. The problem is what happens when the list stops being a list. Because the business never keeps it as just a list. They add relationships, they add status logic, they add approvals, they add security expectations, they add reporting demands, they add automation. And without noticing, they've built a DIY relational database with none of the relational guarantees. This is where it collapses, and it usually collapses in 4 predictable ways. First, relational complexity. The minute you need more than a couple lookups, you're no longer managing a list. You're managing a graph badly. You're storing IDs in text fields, duplicating values to avoid lookup limits, and inventing conventions like title is customer name, project name, year, because you need uniqueness the platform doesn't enforce. Second, integrity gaps. SharePoint will happily let you create orphaned records. It will let you delete something upstream and leave downstream references pointing to nothing. It will let people type Europe, EU, and Europo and treat them as 3 different realities. The system doesn't know what's true. It knows what was entered. Third, scale thresholds and performance ceilings. There are hard limits and soft limits, and the worst part is that teams discover them mid-flight. Query thresholds. View limits, delegation problems in Canvas apps. Suddenly, the simple list turns into a collection of workarounds, indexed columns, filtered views, segmented lists, and Power Automate flows that exist mostly to dodge the platform. Fourth, governance ambiguity. SharePoint can do security, but it's not row-level security with ownership semantics baked into every record as a structural primitive. Dataverse is. In Dataverse, ownership isn't an afterthought. Every row has an owner. You don't negotiate with it. That single design choice changes how reliably you can explain access, auditing, and accountability. And that's the point. Dataverse isn't better because it's more expensive. It's better because it's opinionated about correctness. When you move from SharePoint to Dataverse, you're not just moving data. You're moving from a file and list substrate to a business semantics substrate. You're choosing relationships that enforce meaning. You're choosing role-based security and ownership models that are native, not improvised. You're choosing environments and solutions so change has a life cycle. Bülent frames this in a way that's unusually honest. Dataverse isn't the answer to everything, but it's the answer when that's what you need. That line matters because this isn't SharePoint bashing, it's architectural classification. If the data is really documents, collaboration, and a lightweight index, SharePoint is doing its job. If the data is operational truth, entities with relationships, lifecycle, and policy, then SharePoint is doing cosplay as a database, and you're the one maintaining the costume. The uncomfortable part is when leaders realize how this lesson is learned in the wild. It's rarely learned during design. It's learned during audits, incidents, or integrations. Someone asks for a report that spans multiple lists with consistent definitions, and suddenly the team spends weeks reconciling mismatched values. Someone asks, who can see this record and why? And the answer involves site permissions, list permissions, item permissions, and a spreadsheet. Someone asks Copilot a simple question and gets nonsense back because the system has no stable relationships to retrieve context from. So the migration isn't just moving to Dataverse. It's the point where the organization admits the truth. The system needs to be correct, not just convenient. And once you accept that, the next question becomes inevitable. If the model is the substrate for governance, then governance isn't paperwork, it's design. And that leads straight into the second scenario, audit and compliance readiness, where Dataverse stops being optional and starts being survivable. Scenario 2. Audit and compliance readiness. Governance by design. Audits don't break systems. They reveal what the system already is. Most teams treat governance like paperwork, a policy document, an access review spreadsheet, a we'll tighten it up later promise. Then an auditor shows up and asks a basic question. Who can access this data? What can they do with it? And how do you prove it? That's when the room goes quiet, because the real answer is usually, it depends on where the data lives, which app you used, and whether someone remembered to share the right thing. Dataverse is built to make that answer boring, predictable, defensible. Governance in Dataverse isn't an extra layer you apply. It's a set of structural primitives, security roles, privileges, access levels, and ownership. And the difference between users can't see it and users can't do it is not semantics. That distinction is the audit. Bülent's keys and rooms analogy works because it reflects the model. A security role is the key ring. Privileges are what the key can do. Create, read, write, delete, append, assign, share. Access levels are which rooms those keys open. Your own records, your team's records, your business unit, parent-child business units, or the entire organization. That means the question, can this user view this table? And the question, can this user view this row? Are different questions with different mechanisms. And that matters because auditors will ask both. The first uncomfortable reality is that Dataverse security doesn't negotiate with you. Every row has an owner. That's not a suggestion, it's a structural rule. And ownership isn't a UI field you can hide and forget. Ownership is the foundation of row-level access. If your model assumes this data is shared by default, you're already in conflict with the platform because Dataverse assumes data is owned and access is granted through roles and scope. In practice, that means two things happen in mature environments. One, teams stop treating security as who needs access to the app and start treating it as who needs what rights to which tables at which scope. Two, teams stop assigning roles ad hoc to individuals and start designing access patterns. Role-based access that maps to real job functions. And when scale shows up, team-based ownership becomes less of an option and more of a necessity. Because user ownership is fragile. People leave, people move departments, people go on leave. If your access model assumes individual owners, you have operational risk baked into your table design. Team ownership, by contrast, survives human churn. A team can own rows, a team can carry a security role, and membership can change without rewriting the ownership story of the data. This is why Dataverse security is actually more of an organizational model than a technical setting. It forces you to decide, is this data personal, team-scoped, department-scoped, or organization-scoped? And if you can't answer that, you don't have a governance problem. You have a definition problem. Then there's column-level security, which is where most will just hide it. Approaches die. Sometimes it's not the record that's sensitive. It's one field: salary, legal notes, health data, contract terms, disciplinary status. Dataverse lets you lock down specific columns so that even if someone can read the row, they still can't see the sensitive value. That's not a UX trick. That's enforcement at the data layer. Now connect this back to the earlier point about SharePoint drift. In SharePoint, many governance stories depend on where you put data, how you share it, and whether people behave. In Dataverse, governance is model behavior. Roles, scopes, owners, and field-level controls. That's why leaders usually learn this lesson during audit preparation, not during design, because governance by design sounds like overhead until the first time you have to prove it. And once you have to prove it, you realize the real cost isn't the work of setting roles. The cost is ambiguity. Ambiguity forces manual controls. Manual controls force exceptions. Exceptions generate entropy, and entropy is what auditors call risk. So the strategic point of Dataverse security isn't that it gives you more knobs to turn. It's that it gives you fewer excuses. It turns access into a defined, inspectable system. And once that system is in place, something else happens. The organization starts depending on that structure, not just for audits, but for everything that comes next. Because the next wave isn't compliance, it's AI. And AI doesn't tolerate ambiguity with polite questions. It returns an answer anyway. The AI moment. Context retrieval at scale, not magic. The AI moment is when weak modeling stops being an internal inconvenience and becomes externally visible failure. Because AI doesn't understand your business. It retrieves whatever context your system can supply, then tries to produce a coherent answer. That's it. There is no secret layer where Copilot infers meaning you refuse to define. So when leaders say we'll add AI later, what they're really saying is we'll ask the most demanding consumer of our data to work with the least explicit version of it. That always ends the same way. The simplest way to frame this is Copilot doesn't invent meaning. It consumes meaning. And in Dataverse, meaning lives in the model: table names, column names, descriptions, relationship structure, ownership, and security boundaries. If those are vague, the AI doesn't get confused. It does something worse. It answers anyway. This is why prompt engineering is not a strategy. It's a tax you pay for ambiguity. If your data model is precise, prompts can be simple. Show me all open cases for this customer. If your model is mush, prompts turn into legal documents. When I say case, I mean the service request table, except when type is incident. And ignore rows where status is other and join on customer name, but only if it's not blank. That's not AI readiness. That's coping. So the new readiness test for Dataverse is brutally simple. Can your model explain your business to an AI without you standing there to translate? If the answer is no, then every agent you build will either hallucinate or require escalating amounts of human supervision. And human supervision at AI scale is just manual work with extra steps. This is where relationships stop being nice. They become retrieval infrastructure. A flat model forces AI to guess which fields belong together. A relational model gives AI a navigation graph. It can move from customer to cases to related approvals to exceptions to the owning team and retrieve context that matches how the business actually thinks. That's what people miss when they treat Dataverse like storage. Storage gives you rows. Relationships give you reasoning pathways. And the moment you add multiple apps, those pathways become the only thing that keeps your ecosystem from turning into contradictory truths. Model-driven apps, Canvas apps, Power Pages, Power Automate, Copilot Studio, they all converge on the same substrate. So AI is not one more interface. AI is the first interface that punishes ambiguity instantly in front of everyone. Now tie this back to Bülent's workshop framing. Dataverse 101 is quietly AI 201 groundwork, not because Dataverse is an AI product, because AI demands the thing Dataverse has always been trying to force, explicit semantics. Even the boring stuff becomes AI critical. If you didn't name columns consistently, retrieval becomes probabilistic. If you didn't use descriptions, you lose disambiguation. If you abuse choice fields to represent entities, you collapse structure into strings. If you skipped relationship behavior, you created orphaned records that still exist, still get retrieved, and still contaminate answers. And when AI returns the wrong answer, your users won't blame the data model, they'll blame the AI. But the system is behaving exactly as designed. It's retrieving from an ambiguous substrate and producing plausible output. That's not a model failure in the AI layer, that's a modeling failure in the control plane. This is also where the Dataverse versus SharePoint debate changes shape. SharePoint can store content, it can even power decent retrieval in certain Microsoft 365 Copilot scenarios because the Microsoft Graph does heavy lifting. But when you build agents that need reliable structured truth ownership, row-level security, relationships that represent business concepts, SharePoint lists are not a semantics engine. They're a flat container with references and limits. So you can absolutely build an agent on top of SharePoint. You'll just spend the rest of its life explaining what the data really means. Dataverse shifts that work earlier into the model where it belongs. The payoff is that once the model is stable, AI retrieval becomes less about prompt gymnastics and more about asking normal questions. And that's the future shape of business apps, less UI logic, more semantic substrate with agents operating on top. But there's one more escalation that makes this non-negotiable. Copilot chat is mostly about retrieval and summarization. Agents are different. Agents create state, they create decisions, they create operational records. They don't just read your model, they write to it. And if the model can't hold structured truth over time, your agent doesn't become smart. It becomes noisy. That's the next section. Scenario 3, agents logging state and long-term memory. Once you move from Copilot answering questions to agents doing work, the data problem changes shape. A chat experience can get away with vague context because the user is still in the loop, correcting, clarifying, and re-asking. An agent doesn't live in that world. An agent executes. It takes actions. It makes decisions. It retries. It escalates. It hands off. It keeps going. That means an agent produces operational data whether you planned for it or not. And operational data is not the same thing as business data. Business data is your nouns: customer, case, contract, invoice, approval. Operational data is the exhaust. What the agent saw, what it decided, what it attempted, what failed, what it escalated, what it learned, what it should remember next time. If you don't model that explicitly, you still get it. You just get it in the worst places. Free text notes, message transcripts, scattered Teams chats, random SharePoint lists, and temporary logs that become permanent because nobody ever decommissions anything. This is where Dataverse becomes strategic in a way most teams don't expect. Dataverse is not only where you store the truth, it becomes where you store the state. State is the thing agents require to behave consistently across time. What step is this process on? What was the last action taken? Who approved it? What exception was raised? What policy was applied? What input was missing? What confidence level did we have? What remediation occurred? If you don't give an agent structured state, you force it into probabilistic behavior. It guesses what happened based on what it can retrieve. That is not intelligence. That is conditional chaos with better vocabulary. The simple version is agents need memory and memory needs structure. In practical terms, the enterprise pattern looks like this. Agents read from Dataverse to get context, and they write back to Dataverse to record outcomes. The model becomes the shared timeline of truth across humans and automation. You can see the platform pushing in this direction already. Microsoft's Dataverse team has been talking publicly about Dataverse as the data platform for agents, knowledge retrieval, functions, operational logs, and app experiences where humans review agent output. That's not marketing fluff. That's the inevitable architecture, because autonomous work without durable state is just repeated mistakes. Now here's the uncomfortable truth. Grounding reduces hallucination is a half-truth. Grounding reduces hallucination only to the extent that the ground is stable, structured, and semantically navigable. If your model is weak, grounding just makes the agent confidently wrong faster. That's why agent readiness is not, do we have Copilot Studio? It's, can the system hold structured truth over time? This is where things like functions and reusable logic matter. A function is basically you extracting a repeatable business decision into a scalable unit. But a function still needs clean inputs, predictable identifiers, and meaningful relationships. Otherwise, you're automating confusion, and the logging side matters even more than most teams realize. When an agent fails, you need to know why, not emotionally, mechanically. What record did it operate on? What permissions did it have? What relationship path did it traverse? What rule blocked it? What environment was it in? What version of the solution was deployed? What data was missing? What exception pattern is repeating? If those answers are scattered, you don't have observability. You have storytelling. So the agentic future forces a new requirement. The model must be able to represent process history as data, not as narrative. That usually means new tables, agent runs, agent decisions, exceptions, approvals, escalations, human corrections, and outcomes. It means timestamps and owners. It means correlation IDs. It means explicit relationships between an agent's actions and the business record it acted on. And yes, this can feel like overhead until you operate at scale. Because the moment you have 10 agents touching the same business process, you'll discover the same law we've been circling all episodes. Scale multiplies everything, especially inconsistency. So what changes for leaders? The app is no longer the product. The system of truth is agents will come and go, UI experiences will evolve. But the durable competitive advantage will be, can your organization model reality well enough that autonomous work stays aligned with intent? That's the line between agents that help and agents that create noise. And once you accept that Dataverse is where both business truth and operational memory live, the next scenario becomes obvious. Power Platform at scale is not many apps. It's one model serving many experiences without rewriting itself every quarter. Scenario 4. Power Platform at scale. One model, many apps. Power Platform at scale is where every comfortable shortcut turns into a recurring incident. Because the promise stops being we built an app. The promise becomes we built a capability. And capabilities don't live in a canvas screen, they live in the model. At small scale, teams can pretend each app is its own universe. A canvas app over here, a flow over there, a list somewhere, maybe a model-driven app later. People handwave integration as we'll connect it. Security as we'll lock it down. Reporting as Power BI can figure it out. It feels manageable because the blast radius is small. Then the organization does what organizations always do. It repeats the pattern. A second app needs the same customer concept. A third app needs the same approval concept. A fourth app needs the same status concept. And suddenly you aren't building apps anymore. You're building a platform, whether you admit it or not. This is where Dataverse reveals what it really is. A shared schema that multiple experiences converge on. Model-driven apps, Canvas apps, Power Pages, Power Automate, Copilot Studio, Power BI. None of them are the center. The model is. And once you have multiple consumers, the model stops being a background choice and becomes a scaling interface. The foundational mistake at scale is building for launch. Launch-driven models optimize for the first UI and the first workflow. They don't optimize for the fifth app, the 10th flow, the first integration rewrite, or the first agent that needs context across entities. So when the next app shows up, the model gets tweaked. Columns get repurposed. Relationships get added late. Naming drifts. Choices get overloaded, and because the platform is flexible, it lets you ship. But the cost shows up as schema churn, constant small changes that break things you forgot were dependent. That's why smart teams treat the data model as the platform, not as an artifact of a single app. One model, many apps is the point. It means you can build a model-driven app for internal operations and a Power Pages portal for external users, both reading the same truth. It means you can build a Canvas app for mobile scenarios without inventing a parallel schema. It means Power Automate flows don't have to translate between different versions of customer case or contract. It means reporting is an expression of the model, not a reconciliation project. And it means you can introduce AI without creating a new abstraction layer to compensate for a fragmented data story. That's the leverage, reuse, and consistency. Not as a best practice, as a survival mechanism. Because at scale, the enemy is not missing features. The enemy is inconsistency. Inconsistency creates integration rewrites. It creates security exceptions. It creates reporting disputes. It creates AI prompt tax. And then teams call it governance overhead, when the real overhead is relearning the same concept in 4 different apps. This is also where standards stop being bureaucracy and start being speed. A stable naming scheme becomes a multiplier. Descriptions become a multiplier. A clear ownership pattern becomes a multiplier. A relationship-first approach becomes a multiplier. Solutions and environments become a multiplier. Because the organization can add new apps without forcing a remodel of reality every time. Bülent's line, Dataverse gives meaning to the data you keep, lands differently here. At scale, meaning is not philosophical, it's operational. Meaning is what prevents the 5th app from breaking the 1st app. Meaning is what lets the 6th flow reuse the same relationships without inventing new joins. Meaning is what makes an agent retrieve the right context without you hand-holding it. And this is where the paradox shows up. Teams that obsess over delivery speed at the start move slower later. Teams that invest in modeling intent early move faster forever. Not because they're more mature, because they reduce their degrees of freedom. They constrain the system into predictable shapes. They made the platform boring in the right places. So when an executive asks, why are we spending time on the model? The correct answer is because this is the only part that can scale. Screens don't scale, people don't scale, meetings don't scale, a coherent model scales. And once you're operating one model across many apps, you start seeing the failure modes early. You can spot them, you can name them, you can stop them before they become architectural erosion. That's the next step. Call out the anti-patterns that leaders must recognize before low-code innovation turns into high-code cleanup. Anti-patterns leaders must recognize early. Every platform has failure modes. Dataverse just makes them more expensive because it can scale them. So if leadership wants a real advantage, it isn't more makers or more apps. It's learning to spot the patterns that quietly turn a semantics engine into a storage bin with delusions of governance. These are the anti-patterns. Name them early, because once they ship, they become political. First, the one-table trap. We'll start with one table and add columns as we go. It feels fast because it is fast, until the table becomes a junk drawer for 3 different nouns. Then reporting becomes conditional logic, security becomes unexplainable, and integrations can't tell what a row even is. That's not an MVP. That's semantic collapse. Second, SharePoint as a database. SharePoint can store lists and files. It can't enforce reality at scale. So teams simulate relationships with lookups, repeated values, and compensating flows until thresholds, delegation limits, and audit ambiguity show up. Then they don't migrate. They optimize the workaround. Third, screen-driven modeling. The UI becomes the schema. You build tables to match the form, and the model becomes a screenshot. The tell is step-shaped columns. Approver 2, step 3 complete. Because you embedded a workflow engine inside a table, every process change becomes a schema change. Fourth, copy-paste environment syndrome. Teams clone broken assumptions across dev, test, prod, and call it ALM. Then prod drifts, unmanaged overrides pile up, and nobody trusts what version means. Testing becomes theater. You don't refute these with KPIs. You refute them with consequences. Fewer breaking schema changes after go-live, simpler audit answers, less prompt gymnastics, and new apps launched without renegotiating what words mean. If meaning isn't in the model, it isn't in the system. It's in people's heads, and people's heads don't scale. And what smart teams do differently? Modeling for change. Smart teams don't model better. They model with a different purpose. Most teams model to ship. Smart teams model to survive change. That distinction matters because Dataverse doesn't punish you for launching. It punishes you for drifting. Over time, your model either stays coherent or it becomes a pile of exceptions that only the original builders can interpret. So what do smart teams do differently? They start with intent, not UI. They don't begin with what fields should be on the form. They begin with what concepts exist, what do they mean, and what is the smallest set of nouns we can standardize without lying to ourselves. Then they design relationships to encode those nouns, and only then do they build screens. Because screens are consumption, the model is definition. Second, they design for additive change. Most organizations treat change like a rewrite. They refactor schemas because they didn't leave space for evolution. Smart teams assume change is constant, so they bias toward patterns that can expand without breaking existing meaning. That usually means stable identifiers, clear primary names, and columns that don't change semantics every quarter. If a field starts as department and later becomes cost center, they don't reuse the field. They add a new one, deprecate the old, and preserve meaning. Because reusing fields is how you corrupt history. Dataverse will store your data forever. The model should respect that. Third, they treat metadata like a product surface. Names are not decoration. Descriptions are not optional. Choice labels are not good enough. If an agent is going to query your model, your metadata is part of the interface contract. So smart teams document intent inside the model, table descriptions, column descriptions, meaningful relationship names, and consistent vocabulary. They also treat synonyms deliberately where AI will depend on them because customer in one team and client in another is not a language problem. It's a model problem. Fourth, they use constraints as guardrails, not as friction. They embrace what Dataverse enforces: ownership, security roles, relationship behaviors, and environment boundaries. They don't try to bypass those because it slows us down. They know the bypass becomes permanent. So they choose referential versus parental behavior deliberately. They restrict deletes where evidence matters. They model many-to-many as an entity when the association has attributes. They refuse to hide core concepts inside text. This is what enforcing assumptions at scale actually looks like. The platform does the enforcement so humans don't have to remember. Fifth, they make ALM part of the model strategy. They don't treat environments and solutions as release mechanics. They treat them as meaning protection. Development is where ideas are allowed to be wrong. Test is where behavior is validated. Production is where meaning becomes contract. And solutions are how they transport that contract without letting random changes accumulate in the active layer. They choose managed deployments once they leave experimentation, because the goal is not freedom. The goal is determinism. Sixth, they build a shared ownership model, not a hero culture. They name a model owner, not as a committee, as a role with authority. That owner doesn't gatekeep, they curate. They reduce duplication, they kill junk tables, they protect core concepts from becoming junk drawers. They say no to entropy generators and they say yes to changes that preserve meaning. This is where leadership actually shows up, not by approving app ideas, by funding the discipline that keeps the platform coherent when the org inevitably scales. And the final difference is the one most teams don't want to hear. Smart teams measure success by how boring the model becomes. If the model stops changing every week, that's not stagnation, that's stability. If new apps can ship without schema churn, that's not luck, that's architecture. If audits stop being drama and start being routine, that's not because you wrote better documents. It's because the system behaves predictably under stress. And if AI agents can retrieve context without prompt novels, that's not because the agent is smarter, it's because your model stopped forcing it to guess. So if you want the simplest practical move you can make tomorrow, it's this. Before you build your next app, write down the nouns, define them. Decide ownership, decide relationships, decide what status means, decide which concepts are global and which are local. Then build screens, because low-code doesn't reduce thinking, it just accelerates the consequences of not doing it. Conclusion. Model smarter today or pay later. The future isn't built by better apps. It's built by better models of reality that can survive audits, scale, and AI. If you want a grounded reset on the fundamentals, go watch Bülent Altinsoy's Dataverse 101 session next, then challenge your next app idea. Name the business concepts, define the relationships, and decide ownership before you design a single screen. Subscribe for more strategy-first breakdowns across Dataverse, Power Platform, and Copilot, and watch that workshop right after this.